The ship came out of hyperspace like a stone thrown into a still lake, and for a moment, everything on the bridge went quiet. Captain Park Do-hoon stood with his hands behind his back and stared through the wide front window at the thing floating in the darkness ahead. It was not a planet. It was not a moon. It was a station, but that word felt too small for what he was looking at. Aethys Prime stretched across the black like a city built by gods. Rings of metal and light turned slowly around a core so old that the stars near it had been born and died while it kept spinning. Do-hoon had spent 20 years in the military. He had seen things that made other men lose sleep, but nothing had prepared him for this. Behind him, the bridge crew worked in tense silence. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. The ESV Horizon was the finest ship Earth had ever built, and out here it looked like a toy floating next to a cathedral. Do-hoon pressed the comm panel on his chair. "Ambassador, we have arrived. 3 levels below the bridge." Ambassador Baek Tae-ho stood in front of a mirror in the diplomatic quarters and adjusted the collar of his dark blue uniform. He was 52 years old, and had spent most of those years learning how to stay calm when everything around him was falling apart. Today would test that skill more than any day before it. He read through his speech one more time, moving his lips without sound, and then set the paper down. In the next room, Han Ji-woo sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by screens. He was not a soldier or a politician. He was a linguist, a man who had spent his life studying dead languages on Earth, languages that no living person spoke anymore. He had been pulled from a quiet university office 6 months ago and told that Earth needed him. He still was not sure why. Yunari leaned against the doorframe, watching him work. She was younger than Ji-woo, but carried herself like someone who had already seen too much. As an intelligence analyst, it was her job to know things before anyone else did. Right now, she knew something that made her stomach tight. "They are already calling us primitives," she said. "I pulled it from their open channels. Several species have listed us as level 9. That is the lowest rank on their scale, 1 step above animals." Ji-woo looked up from his screens. "What is 1 step below animals?" "There is no step below animals. That is the point." In the corner of the room, Kang So-ha pulled off her headphones and turned around in her chair. She was the youngest member of the team, 28 years old, and still carrying the energy of someone who believed the universe owed her something wonderful. "I found something strange," she said. "There is a signal buried in the background noise of the station. Very faint, very old. It is repeating, but I cannot figure out what it means." Ji-woo looked at her. "Save it. We will look at it later." The shuttle carried them from the horizon to the station. Do-hoon stayed behind on the ship. He watched from the bridge as the tiny craft crossed the distance and disappeared into one of the station's docking ports, like a seed falling into the mouth of a whale. Inside Aethys Prime, the human delegation walked through corridors that were wider than rivers. The walls were made of a dark metal that seemed to breathe with a faint inner light. Other species moved around them, some walking, some floating, some crawling on limbs that did not have names in any Earth language. Most of them were tall. All of them were old, in the sense that their civilizations had been crossing the stars, while humans were still figuring out fire. A few of them looked at the humans. Some looked away quickly. Others stared with open curiosity, or something worse. One group of tall, thin creatures with silver skin made a sound that Nari's translator flagged as laughter. The grand chamber was the largest room Ji-woo had ever been inside. It was round, rising up in layers like the inside of a shell, and every layer was filled with delegates from hundreds of species. The noise was enormous, a storm of alien voices speaking in languages that overlapped and clashed. At the very center, on a raised platform of white stone, sat the Grand Arbiter. Valesi was old. Not old the way humans understood old, but old the way mountains are old. He was Pelani, and his body was long and angular, wrapped in robes that seemed to be made of frozen light. His face had no expression that a human could read, but his eyes moved with sharp intelligence as the human delegation entered. The chamber did not go quiet when the humans arrived, but it did get quieter. Enough beings turned to watch that a ripple of silence spread outward from the entrance. Valesi spoke. His voice filled the chamber without effort. The species called human, from the world called Earth, is recognized. You may present your petition. Ambassador Bake stepped forward. He looked small in that vast room, but his voice did not shake. He spoke of Earth. He spoke of peace. He spoke of the desire to learn, to trade, to stand among the stars as equals. It was a good speech. Jiwoo thought it was a very good speech. Almost nobody listened. Delegates talked among themselves. One species near the front made a gesture that the translator identified as dismissal. Another said something that came through as, "Their language sounds like broken machinery." When Bake finished, Valesi thanked him with words that were polite and empty. "Your petition will be reviewed," the Grand Arbiter said. "The process will follow standard procedure." Nari leaned close to Jiwoo. Standard procedure for a species they do not care about takes between 200 and 400 years. The delegation walked back through the corridors in silence. Bake kept his face still and calm. Soha looked angry. Nari looked like she was already planning something. Jiwoo stopped walking. The others went on a few steps before they noticed. He was staring at the wall. There, carved into the dark metal in lines so fine they were almost invisible, was a script. It was not like any alien writing he had seen on the screens. It was older, much older. And something about the shape of the characters, the way the lines curved and broke, made his heart beat faster. He had seen shapes like these before, not here, not in space, on Earth, in the oldest clay tablets ever pulled from the ground. Nari came back to him. "What is it?" Jiwoo did not answer right away. He raised his hand and traced the air in front of the ancient script, not touching it, just following its shape. His mind was racing. "I have seen this before," he whispered. Above them, a security drone turned its lens toward the human, who stood alone in the corridor, staring at writing that no living species in the galaxy had been able to read for 100,000 years. Jiwoo did not sleep that night. He set up a workspace in the corner of their quarters, using every screen he had brought from the ship, and he spread the photographs of the wall inscriptions across all of them. The characters glowed in the dim room like something alive, and he sat in front of them with his eyes moving back and forth, the way a man reads a letter from someone he loved a long time ago. Nari brought him tea. She set it down beside him and watched his face. She had known Jiwoo for 3 years, and she had never seen him look like this. It was not excitement. It was something deeper than excitement. It was the look of a man who had just found the thing he had been searching for his entire life, without knowing he was searching. "Talk to me," she said. He pointed at the screen. "This character here, you see the way it curves at the top and then breaks into 2 lines going down? I have seen this exact shape before, in Proto-Elamite. It is one of the oldest writing systems on Earth, over 5,000 years old, and we never fully decoded it." He moved to another screen. "And this one, the way these 3 marks sit together, it looks like early Sumerian, but not exactly. It is like a cousin, like they came from the same parent." Nari sat down next to him. "You are saying that the writing on these walls, writing that belongs to an alien species that disappeared 100,000 years ago, is related to languages on Earth?" "I'm saying it is possible." "Jiwoo, if the Council hears you say that, they might kill us." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. "Keep working." By morning, Soha had joined them. She brought the signal she had found the day before, the faint repeating pattern buried in the station's background noise. And she played it through a visualizer so they could see its shape. It rose and fell in waves that were not random. There was structure in it. Rhythm. When Jiwoo laid the wave pattern next to the inscriptions, something clicked into place like a key turning in a lock. "It is the same language," Soha said, her voice shaking slightly. "The signal is not noise. It is a message, and it matches the writing on the walls." Jiwoo leaned back and closed his eyes. His mind was doing something it had not done in years. It was connecting pieces that should not connect, pulling threads from Sumerian and Proto-Elamite and Linear A and a dozen other dead languages and weaving them together with the alien script in front of him. The picture that formed was impossible, and it was beautiful. "The Hollow Ones came to Earth," he said quietly, "a very long time ago. They did not just watch us, they spoke to us. They communicated with the earliest humans, and pieces of their language were absorbed into ours. We have been carrying fragments of their words in the roots of our oldest languages for thousands of years. We just never knew where they came from." Soha stared at him. "That would mean human language is partly alien. It would mean that we are the only species in this galaxy that has the old tongue living inside our words. Every other species kept it locked away as something holy and untouchable. We kept it alive without even knowing it." Captain Do-hoon came down from the ship that afternoon. He stood in the doorway of their quarters and listened to Jiwoo explain everything. His face did not change expression, but his hands tightened at his sides. "You are sure about this?" he asked. "I am sure enough to keep working," Jiwoo said. "I am not sure enough to bet all of humanity on it. Not yet." Ambassador Baek was less calm. He paced the room with his hands behind his back, and Jiwoo could see the calculations running behind his eyes. "If you are right," Baek said, "this changes everything. If you are wrong, this ends everything. The Council already thinks we are insects. If we claim a connection to their gods, and we cannot prove it, they will not just deny us a seat. They will make an example of us." "I understand," Jiwoo said. "Do you? Because I need you to understand that I have 6 billion people depending on what happens in this station." Jiwoo met his eyes. "I understand, Ambassador." That night, Nari did something dangerous. She slipped out of their quarters and moved through the lower corridors of the station, using routes she had mapped from the security feeds. She found a terminal connected to a minor archive, one that was not heavily guarded, and she broke through its protections with tools she had built herself. What she found inside was a partial lexicon of the old tongue, a document so classified that most council species had never seen it. She copied it and returned without being caught. When she gave it to Jiwoo, he spread it across his screens and began comparing it to his reconstructions. The gaps started to fill. Words that had been shadows became solid. Grammar that had been guesswork became certain. The old tongue was not just a language. It was a system, elegant and precise, built to carry meaning across species and across time. And human languages had been carrying its bones for millennia. The next day, a message came to their quarters through a channel that should not have existed. It was from Delegate Omura, a Tessari who sat in the middle ranks of the council. She wanted to meet. Nari went alone. Omura was smaller than most council delegates, with dark eyes that moved quickly, and a voice that was soft but clear. She met Nari in a maintenance corridor deep in the station. "The council is going to deny your petition. They are also going to place Earth under observation restrictions. Your planet will be monitored. Your ships will be tracked. You will not be allowed to leave your own system without permission." Nari kept her expression flat. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because there is one law that even the Grand Arbiter cannot break. It is older than the Council itself. Any species that speaks the old tongue in the Grand Chamber must be heard. Not dismissed, not reviewed. Heard. Omura paused. Can your linguist really read those inscriptions? Nari thought about Jiwoo sitting on the floor surrounded by screens, his eyes red from lack of sleep, his hands steady, his mind reaching across 100,000 years to catch words that everyone else had let fall. Yes, she said. He can. That night, Jiwoo worked until his vision blurred and his hands shook. Soha sat beside him, filling in patterns, catching mistakes, feeding him water when he forgot to drink. Nari stood guard by the door. Near dawn, Jiwoo stopped. He looked at the screen in front of him, and then he looked at Soha. She nodded. He had enough. He opened his mouth and spoke a single sentence in the old tongue. The words were strange and ancient, and they moved through the air like something heavy and alive. The lights in the room flickered. The floor hummed beneath them. And somewhere, deep in the bones of Aethys Prime, in systems that had been sleeping for longer than human civilization had existed, something woke up. The first sign was the light. It began in the walls of the human quarters, a slow golden pulse that moved through the dark metal like blood through veins. Then the pulse spread. It moved down the corridor and out into the wider passages of Aethys Prime, racing through the bones of the ancient station in every direction. Within minutes, parts of the station that had been dark and sealed for 100,000 years began to open. Doors that had no visible seams cracked apart. Corridors that had been listed as dead space on every map suddenly filled with warm, breathless light. Deep in the lowest levels of the station, machines older than most civilizations began to turn. Holographic projectors that had been waiting in silence since before humanity learned to walk now flickered and threw images into the empty air. Faces that belonged to no species anyone alive had ever seen. The council went into chaos. On the bridge of the horizon, Captain Dohun watched through his external cameras as the entire surface of Aethys Prime lit up in patterns that had not been visible for longer than recorded history. His communications officer turned to him with wide eyes. Captain, every frequency on the station is going wild. The Council security forces are mobilizing. They are sealing corridors and issuing emergency orders. Dohun stood very still. Get me a line to Ambassador Bake, now. In the human quarters, Jiwoo stood in the center of the room, with his mouth still slightly open from the sentence he had spoken. The golden light pulsed around him. Soha was on her feet, her hands pressed flat against the wall, feeling it vibrate under her palms like the chest of something breathing. Nari had her weapon drawn, not because she knew what to shoot at, but because it was the only thing she could think to do. What did you do? Nari asked. I spoke to it, Jiwoo said quietly, and it answered. Council security arrived within minutes. 6 armored soldiers from 3 different species filled the doorway, their weapons raised. Behind them, a senior official, with a face like cracked stone, demanded that the humans surrender immediately. Ambassador Bake stepped forward before anyone could react. He raised his hands, palms out, and spoke in a voice that was calm and measured. We will cooperate fully, but I want it noted that we have done nothing aggressive. My linguist spoke words, that is all. They were escorted through the station under heavy guard. The corridors they passed through were filled with confusion. Alien species of every shape crowded against the walls, staring at the lights that had come alive around them, whispering in voices that the translators could barely keep up with. Some were afraid, some were angry. A few had fallen to their knees. The guards brought them down, deeper into the station than any current species had been in living memory. The lower levels of Aethys Prime were not like the upper ones. There were no polished surfaces here, no elegant curves. These halls were raw and ancient, carved from something that was not quite metal and not quite stone. The inscriptions on the walls were everywhere now, and Jiwoo could not stop reading them. His eyes moved from line to line as he walked, and the words poured into him like water into dry ground. They reached a chamber that was perfectly round, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. In the center of the chamber, a holographic projection hung in the air. It was a figure. Tall, slender, with long arms and a face that was smooth and ageless. It was not alive. It was a recording, a message left behind by something that had been gone for a very long time. The figure spoke. Its voice was the old tongue, and it filled the chamber the way sunlight fills a room, touching everything, warming everything. Jiwoo listened. His lips moved as he followed the words. "What is it saying?" Nari asked. "It is welcoming us," Jiwoo said. His voice was thick with something close to emotion. "It is saying, 'Welcome to the children who found their way home.' And then it is giving a warning. It says there is a test, and the test must be passed, or the station will go silent again." Behind them, the guards had lowered their weapons. They were staring at the holographic figure, with faces that showed something Jiwoo had not expected to see on alien soldiers. Awe. Volesi came down to the lower levels himself, accompanied by a full escort and a dozen senior delegates. When he entered the chamber and saw the holographic figure of the Hollow One, still speaking in the golden air, he stopped. For 5 long seconds, the most powerful being in the galaxy stood perfectly still and said nothing. Then he turned to Jiwoo. "What have you done?" "I spoke the old tongue," Jiwoo said. "The station recognized it." "That is not possible. No living species knows the old tongue. It is sacred. It is lost." "It is not lost," Jiwoo said. "It was never lost. It was waiting." The political explosion happened fast. Within hours, the grand chamber was filled again, and this time the noise was not dismissive laughter. It was fear and fury, and something older than both. Some delegates demanded that the humans be arrested for desecrating the sacred language. Others argued that the humans should be studied, taken apart, examined to find out how they carried the old tongue. A few, and Jiwoo noticed that Delegate Omura was among them, stood quietly and said nothing, watching the chaos with patient eyes. Ambassador Baek requested the floor. Volesi, who looked like he had aged 1,000 years in a single day, allowed it. Baek did not raise his voice. He did not make grand claims. He simply looked up at the Grand Arbiter and said, "Under the law of the old tongue, which predates this council and every species in it, any being that speaks the ancient language in the Grand Chamber has the right to be heard. Not reviewed, not postponed, heard. We request a formal hearing." The chamber fell silent. Every delegate knew the law. It was carved into the foundation stones of the council itself, written in the same script that now glowed on the walls around them. Volesi stared down at the human ambassador for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice was heavy with something that might have been respect or might have been dread. "The law is clear. A hearing will be granted. But understand this, human. The hearing takes the form of the trial of words. Your linguist must prove his command of the old tongue before the full council. If he succeeds, your species will be heard as the law demands. If he fails, your species will be erased from the records of this council. You will be removed from the galaxy's memory as if you never existed." Baek did not flinch. "We accept." Back in their quarters, the weight of what had happened settled on them like snow. Soha sat with her head in her hands. Dohun's voice came through the calm, steady but tight, asking for updates. Baek stood by the window, looking out at the lights of the station that were still pulsing with awakened energy. Jiwoo sat on the floor with his screens around him. Nari crouched beside him. "How much of the old tongue can you actually speak?" she asked. He did not lie to her. "About 40%, maybe less. The trial is in 2 days." "I know." She looked at him. and in her eyes there was no fear. There was something harder than fear and brighter than hope. "Then we have 2 days to learn a language that has been dead for 100,000 years. Jiwoo nodded. He stood up, and he looked at all of them. His team, his people, the only humans within 1,000 light-years. "There is an archive below us," he said. "The Hollow Ones left it there. Everything they knew, everything they were, it is down there waiting. I need to go into it." Soha lifted her head. "I am coming with you." Nobody argued. Nobody slept. They walked together into the deepest level of Aethys Prime, where the oldest archive in the galaxy sat in the dark like a library made of light, silent and patient, and full of words that had not been spoken since before the stars that lit the human sky were born. The archive did not teach the way a book teaches. It taught the way a river teaches a stone, by surrounding it completely and not letting go. Jiwoo and Soha walked into the chamber, and the holographic systems came alive around them, wrapping them in light and sound and meaning. The Hollow Ones had not simply recorded their language, they had recorded the experience of speaking it, the feeling of it in the throat, the weight of each word in the mind, the way one thought connected to the next, like links in a chain that had no end. Jiwoo stood in the center of it and let it wash over him. For the first hour, it was like drowning. The language was vast and precise, and nothing in his experience had prepared him for its depth. Each word carried not just meaning, but history, layers of context that went back further than he could reach. He stumbled. He fell to his knees. The light around him pulsed and waited, and then continued. Soha worked beside him, and she suffered for it. By the end of the first day, blood was running from her nose and her head ached so badly she could barely see. But she did not stop. She sat on the floor of the archive with her eyes closed and her hands moving in the air, tracing the shapes of characters that the holograms projected around her, memorizing patterns that Jiwoo needed but could not hold in his mind alone. On the second day, something changed. The language stopped fighting Jiwoo and began to flow. He stopped translating and started understanding. Words he had struggled with for hours suddenly made sense, not because he figured them out, but because they settled into places in his mind that had always been empty, places that the old tongue had carved into human language thousands of years ago, and that had been waiting to be filled. He began to understand the story of the Hollow Ones. They were the first, not the first intelligent species, but the first to reach the stars. They had found the galaxy empty and cold, and they had decided to fill it. They seeded life on thousands of worlds. They guided young species from mud to fire to metal to light. They built Aethys Prime as a meeting place, a home for the children they would never see grow up. And when they had done all they could do, they looked out at the edge of the galaxy and saw something coming, a silence, a darkness, something that ate stars and swallowed light and left nothing behind. They could not stop it, not yet. So they left. They went somewhere beyond the edge of known space to prepare, and they left behind their language as a key, a way for their children to unlock the knowledge they would need when the silence finally arrived. On the morning of the trial, Jiwoo walked out of the archive on legs that shook. Soha walked beside him, pale and thin but standing. Nari met them with water and food, and a look that asked every question without speaking a word. It was enough. The grand chamber was full. Not just full, but overflowing. Species that had not attended a council session in centuries had come. The air was heavy with tension, and the sound of 1,000 whispered conversations in 100 different languages. Every eye turned to the entrance when the human delegation walked in. Jiwoo walked at the front. He wore no armor, carried no weapon, bore no title. He was a linguist from a small planet on the edge of the galaxy, and he was about to speak a dead language in front of every civilization that existed. Grand Arbiter Valesi sat on his platform of white stone and looked down at the human with an expression that Jiwoo could not read. The chamber fell silent. "The trial of words will begin," Valesi said. "3 challenges will be given. The human called Han Jiwoo will answer them in the old tongue. There will be no assistance, no tools, no machines. Only his voice. If he fails, the consequences have been stated." Jiwoo stepped forward into the center of the chamber. The floor beneath him was made of the same ancient material as the lower levels, and he could feel it humming under his feet, alive and listening. The first challenge was the naming. Valesi spoke the names of the 12 founding species of the Council. The species that had been the first to gather at Aethys Prime under the guidance of the Hollow Ones. He spoke them in the modern Galactic tongue, and then he asked Jiwoo to speak their true names, the names given to them by the Hollow Ones in the old tongue. Jiwoo closed his eyes. The archive had shown him these names. They were not just sounds. Each name was a description, a blessing, a promise. He spoke them one by one, and as each name left his mouth, the chamber reacted. Delegates from the named species sat forward in their seats. Some of them had tears running down faces that were not shaped like human faces. They had never heard their own true names spoken aloud. They had worshipped the Hollow Ones for 100,000 years, and never once heard the words their creators had used to call them beloved. The second challenge was the recitation. Valesi asked Jiwoo to speak the founding oath of the Council, the original words that the Hollow Ones had used when they established Aethys Prime as a place of peace. Jiwoo began. The words came out strong and clear, and the station itself seemed to listen. The walls glowed brighter. The air vibrated. But halfway through, he stumbled. A phrase slipped from his memory like sand through fingers, and for one terrible moment, the chamber held its breath. In the gallery above, Soha leaned forward. She had memorized the oath alongside Jiwoo in the archive, holding the parts he could not carry. Her lips moved, shaping the missing words without sound. He caught the shapes of her mouth, and the words came back to him, and he finished the oath without breaking stride. The chamber trembled. The floor hummed. The station recognized its own founding words being spoken for the first time since its builders walked its halls. The third challenge was the question. Valesi looked down at Jiwoo and spoke in the old tongue. Jiwoo understood every word. The question was, why did the Makers leave? This was not in the archive. The Hollow Ones had not explained their departure in simple terms. They had left clues. They had left stories. But the direct answer to this question had never been recorded. Jiwoo had to answer from his own understanding. The chamber was so silent that Jiwoo could hear his own heartbeat. He thought of the archive and everything it had shown him. He thought of the Korean scholars who had preserved their language through centuries of invasion and occupation, copying texts by hand in hidden rooms so that the words would not die. He thought of the Sumerian poets who carved their thoughts into clay so that someone, someday, would read them. He thought of every human being who had ever refused to let a word be forgotten. He opened his mouth and spoke in the old tongue. The words were his own, built from the grammar and the heart of a language that had been dead for longer than human history. When he finished, the translation moved through the chamber in whispers. They left because the children must one day speak for themselves. They left because love is not shelter, it is trust. The station responded. Every system the Hollow Ones had ever built came alive at once. The walls blazed with light. The ceiling of the grand chamber opened to reveal a holographic projection so vast it took the breath from every being in the room. It was a map of the galaxy as it had been 100,000 years ago, bright and full and alive. And at the edge of that map, creeping inward like frost on glass, was the silence. the darkness the Hollow Ones had seen coming. It was still out there, and it was closer now than it had been when they left. Valesi stared at the map. Then he looked down at Jiwoo, the Grand Arbiter, the most powerful being in the galaxy, a creature older than human civilization, lowered his head. It was not a deep bow. It was a small movement, barely visible. But every delegate in the chamber saw it, and the meaning was clear. "The human has spoken," Valesi said, and his voice carried through the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "The old tongue lives. Let no being here deny them their voice." The chamber erupted. He was still standing in the center of the floor, his eyes on the map above him, watching the darkness at the edge of the galaxy, and thinking about what comes after you prove you have a voice. You have to decide what to say. The days that followed the trial were like the days after an earthquake. Everything looked the same on the surface, but underneath, the ground had shifted in ways that would take years to fully understand. The Grand Council moved quickly, not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. The law was clear. The old tongue had been spoken. The humans had passed the trial, and the galaxy had to make room. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Council. But it was not the standard membership that new species received. The quiet seat in the back row, the polite nod that meant nothing. Valesi, standing before the full assembly with the holographic map of the approaching darkness still glowing above the chamber, announced that the humans would hold the title of Keepers of the Old Tongue. It was a rank that had not existed since the Hollow Ones themselves walked the halls of Aethys Prime. It meant that humanity was not just a member of the council. It was a guardian of the language that held the council together. The reaction was not simple. Nothing involving hundreds of species ever is. Some delegates rose from their seats and made gestures of respect so old that the translators could barely process them. Others sat in heavy silence, their faces showing the difficult work of accepting that everything they believed about the order of the galaxy had changed in the space of a few days. And some, a few, left the chamber entirely, unwilling or unable to accept that a species they had laughed at now held a rank higher than their own. Ambassador Bake handled it all, with the steady calm that had carried him through the worst day of his career. He accepted congratulations without pride, and received cold silences without anger. In private, in the quiet of the human quarters, he sat down heavily, and put his face in his hands, and allowed himself 5 minutes of honest fear before standing up again and getting back to work. The political shifts came fast. Within hours of the announcement, diplomatic messages began arriving at the human quarters. Some were formal requests for alliance. Some were offers of trade. Some were warnings, carefully worded, but clear in meaning, from species that did not like what had happened and wanted the humans to know it. Nori sorted through all of them with the focus and speed of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment, separating the genuine from the false, the hopeful from the dangerous. Delegate Omura came to see them in person. She walked into their quarters without escort, which was a statement in itself, and she stood before Ambassador Bake with her dark eyes steady. "My people have a belief," she said. "We has carried it for thousands of years. We believed that one day a younger species would come to the council and wake the old tongue from its sleep. Many of us had stopped believing it would happen. I did not." She paused. "The Tasari will stand with Earth, openly and fully." Bake bowed his head. "We will not forget this. I do not expect you to. That is why we are standing with you." On the horizon, Captain Dohun received a transmission from Earth. It was routed through 6 relay stations and took 11 minutes to arrive. And when it did, it was not from the military or the government. It was from a news broadcast. The story had already reached home. Do-hun stood on his bridge and listened to the voice of a reporter describing what had happened. And for the first time in weeks, the tightness in his chest loosened. He had brought his ship and his crew across the galaxy into a place where they were not wanted, and they had survived. More than survived. They had changed the shape of history. He looked out the window at Aethys Prime. The station was still glowing with the golden light that Jiwoo had awakened, and beside it, the horizon floated like a small bright fish next to a whale. But it did not look small to Do-hun anymore. It looked like exactly what it was, the first ship, the beginning of something. Below the station, in the diplomatic halls, Baek prepared his final address to the council. He had spent the night writing it, crossing out lines and rewriting them, searching for words that were honest without being proud. When he stood before the assembly for the last time, he did not speak about victory. He did not remind them of the laughter. He did not list the insults that had been thrown at his species since they arrived. He spoke first in Korean. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the way that truth carries, without effort. He spoke about a country on Earth that had been invaded many times over many centuries, a small country surrounded by larger ones, and how the people of that country had kept their language alive through every occupation and every attempt to erase it. He spoke about how they copied their books in secret and taught their children in hidden rooms and refused, generation after generation, to let their words die. He spoke about how language is not just a tool for communication. It is the sound a civilization makes when it refuses to be silent. Then he spoke in the old tongue. He spoke a single sentence, and the translation moved through the chamber like wind through tall grass. Every voice, no matter how small, carries the weight of all who spoke before it. The chamber was quiet for a long time after that. That evening, while the rest of the team celebrated in their own tired ways, Jiwoo went back to the archive. He walked through the corridors alone, past the guards who now stepped aside for him with something close to reverence, and he entered the chamber where the holograms still glowed. He sat down among the projections of ancient stars and let the silence settle around him. Soha found him there an hour later. She sat down beside him without speaking, and for a while they just watched the stars turn slowly in the air above them. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "The map," he said. "The silence. The thing the Hollow Ones saw coming." Soha looked up at the projection. The map of the approaching darkness was still there, hanging at the edge of the galaxy, like a storm on the horizon. It was not a metaphor. It was not a legend. It was real, and it was moving. "They left us the language for a reason," Jiwoo said. "Not just so we could pass a trial or earn a seat. They left it because we are going to need it. Whatever is out there, whatever the silence is, the old tongue is the key to understanding it. And right now, we are the only ones who can use that key." Soha was quiet for a moment. "That is a very big responsibility for a species that was being called primitive 3 days ago." Jiwoo almost smiled. "We have always been good at being underestimated." The door to the archive opened, and Nari walked in. She had her jacket off and her sleeves rolled up, and she looked like she had not slept in 2 days, which she had not. She looked at Jiwoo, then at the map, and then at Jiwoo again. "So," she said, "what do we do now?" Jiwoo stood up. He brushed the dust from his clothes and looked at the galaxy spread out above him, billions of stars glowing in the dark, and somewhere at the edge of all that light, a darkness that was patient and hungry and coming closer with every year that passed. The Hollow Ones had trusted their children to face it. They had left behind everything they could, and now it was up to the children to prove that trust was not misplaced. He looked at Nari and at Soha, and he thought about Do-hun on his bridge and Baek in his quarters, and 6 billion people on a small blue planet who were just now learning that they were not alone in the universe, and that the universe needed them more than anyone had imagined. "We do what humans have always done," he said. "We learn, we speak, and we do not go quiet. The archive glowed around them. The ancient stars turned. And somewhere in the deepest systems of Aethys Prime, in circuits older than memory, the Hollow One's message continued to play on a loop. The same message it had been broadcasting into the silence for 100,000 years, waiting for someone to answer. Someone finally had. High above, seen through the transparent dome of the station's upper levels, the ESV horizon sat among warships 1,000 times its size. It was small. It was young. It was surrounded by the light of a civilization that had just woken from a very long sleep. And it was not going anywhere.